This morning, we are going to hear from Dr. Rebecca Ambrose, who is a professor of education at UC Davis. She examines research mostly on how children solve math problems, but of course, she has a large interest as well in teacher supervision. She also works with, sorry, I was interrupted by a message that popped on my screen. She also works with teachers to apply the children's informal understandings about problem solving and their informal strategies. She helps teachers use that information to differentiate and improve instruction in math. She also worked previously as a middle school math teacher for over 10 years. I'm very excited for today's session, and Dr. Ambrose is going to share with us findings from a number of studies that do have information, what scant information there is on teacher supervision practices. And she's also going to take us into a dive at looking at strategies for equity and justice-focused supervision. Welcome, Dr. Ambrose.
Thank you. I just was in the room with my UC Davis colleagues and told them that I'm hoping that this session is interactive so that it's not considered a presentation. Although I do have some information to share with you, I'm hoping that we can have a conversation much like the one that we had during the keynote earlier today. I'm going to ask Celeste to keep an eye on the chat in case there's something there that I don't get a chance to notice. And feel free to put some thoughts in the chat if you feel led to do so, or to raise your hand and share it with us verbally. So one of the things that brings me here to this group today, although I have supervised a little bit way back when I was a graduate student, I did it for a year as kind of a full-time gig. But more recently, I supervised one of our math candidates in her last quarter. But I got much more familiar with the work of supervisors as the director of our teacher education program for 3 years. And I was on the systems side of it in being in the position to hire supervisors, look after their compensation, and so understand how things worked from the institutional perspective. And I want to start out by saying I think it's somewhat dysfunctional, and Celeste and I talked a little bit about that. It positions supervisors as marginalized, and the way that our hiring and compensation practices work, I think, exacerbate that. And so what I hope that you all get from this conference is that you are doing amazing work and you are amazing people. And so while your institutions may not appreciate you and the very important work that you are doing, those of us that work closely with you recognize you and see you and are very grateful that you are here today. And part of what I'm hoping that may come about me sharing what's out there in the literature with you is that you might develop some group solidarity where you might get a greater voice at your institutions in order to advocate for yourselves and your students so that you can do the jobs, the important work better, and have the compensation that you deserve in order to do that work. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and I'm curious to know who's in the room. So you are going to be invited to contribute to this Jamboard. And I'm going to put the link in the chat for you to locate yourself. So you can see that there's a bunch of pins there, and you can move those pins to wherever it is you are. And I'm going to have to stop sharing for a minute so I can. I'm going to ask you a few questions about your experiences prior to being a supervisor and what your status is right now. I tried to set up a poll for us, but that didn't work out too well. So we're going to do the old-fashioned way and ask you to put your thumbs up. So I'm going to stop my share again for a moment. and ask you these questions. So if you can find your thumb up reaction, the reactions are in the lower right-hand corner of the screen. And if you click on that, you'll see a thumbs up. So first of all, put your thumb up if you supervise student teachers. So most of us are supervisors. Put your thumb up if you are a full-time classroom teacher for more than 5 years. So most of us have extensive classroom experience. Put your thumb up if you were in a leadership role in your K-12 school or district at one point. So many of us did that as well. Put your thumb up if you retired from your work in K-12 schools so that you're officially retired. So some of us are officially retired. Put your thumb up if you work part-time as a supervisor. So many of us are part-time. And then put your thumb up if you received dedicated training at your institution to engage as a supervisor. So we see only a few thumbs up on that one. So I did this to show that we have, in the literature, supervisors are often characterized as retired classroom teachers who served in leadership roles and who work as part-time supervisors and did not receive training from their institution to be supervisors. And the take-home message of all that is somehow you're supposed to know how to supervise by having been a classroom teacher. And yet, I think you've all experienced that the work is more complicated than that. And I'm going to share for you some of the different aspects that have been identified as the work of supervisors that help show how complex this work can be. So I'm going to share my screen again. I will do my best to speed up. I tend to.
No, I'm really not. I don't know how to turn it off.
That's okay. I tend to talk slowly.
No, I really wasn't. I don't know how.
So one interesting finding of a survey of 113 programs is that 40% of our supervisors supervise 1 to 4 students, and another 44% supervise 5 to 8. So there's only a few people out there who are supervising as a full-time occupation where that's the only thing that they're doing. And in asking about what are the activities of the supervisor, so again, this is of 113 programs, and the representative of the program was asked to agree or disagree with these various activities. And as you can see, providing instructional feedback, developing relationships with the pre-service teachers, and providing evaluations are the functions that are almost, well, greater than 65% of the program strongly agreed with those as activities of the supervisors. And interesting to me that the developing placements is something that some supervisors are expected to do. Piloting innovation and programmatic change is less common, and engaging in research is even less common. And the supervisor's priorities for student teachers, this finding is very consistent with what we heard from both of our keynote speakers, is that while critical reflection and adaptive expertise are priorities for student teachers, the social justice priority is farther down on the list. And I think that one of the messages of this conference is that we hopefully can move that up. But there's a lot of institutional pressure for us to do those first two things, and we're the ones who have to bring the social justice perspective to bear in the absence of the institution doing that. So this figure captures this complicated work that you do. And this figure comes out of some work that's being done by some folks in Florida who are trying to understand the various responsibilities of supervisors and the various ways that different individuals interpret their work. And this is a complicated figure, and I'm not going to go into the details of all of it, but it shows that you have to both develop this collaboration with the resident teacher, which is something that we heard Heather talking about just in the last session, if you were there, and that this collaboration and community requires the supervisor to be very aware of the power differentials that can be present when we're working with student teachers, which complicates this work immensely, I think. And the more obvious aspects of our work is the curricular instructional support that we provide to pre-service teachers. And balancing this need for collaboration and communication with the school site, with our perceived need to be providing this instructional feedback, creates a challenge and a tension for supervisors. In fact, there was an interesting study that discussed how it was a math supervisor who was so intent on this part of providing focused instructional feedback and was ignoring the need for collaboration and communication that his supervision was actually very ineffective because the student teacher couldn't take it up because the student teacher has as much allegiance to the resident teacher as they did to the supervisor. And I think that the session that Heather just did also highlighted that. So one of the things that makes this work so complicated is what some people call the two worlds pitfall, but Olson and Buchanan call the two worlds paradox, which is that you as the supervisor are living in both the world of K-12 schooling, and many of you spent most of your careers in this K-12 schooling world, but you also have to navigate the world of higher education. And each of these worlds is complex in and of themselves. So the classroom teacher is sitting within a school in a district that's making demands on them, sitting within the state that's making demands on them. And then we have this sort of cultural expectation of what schools should be. And at the university, we have an equally complex system where the teacher ed program is often not the priority of the School of Education. And the School of Education is not always at the center of the universe of the university. And then there's these broader policies that are impacting all of us. So to navigate all of this and to be mindful of all the standards and mandates that are coming your way as a supervisor, but also to the teacher and to the student teacher, creates this, I think, challenging space to be the authentic self that we were asked to be by the keynote speaker this morning. So in that study where that figure appeared, they talked to 16 teacher educators, 8 of whom were exclusively supervisors, and the other 8 were also faculty teaching classes. And they found that most of the teacher educators lacked formal preparation in their teacher education work. So they were never provided with professionally agreed upon sets of knowledge and approaches to help them accomplish this work. So the effect of that was that they were very susceptible to contextual influences of the workplaces. So they always had to kind of fall back on their sort of gut of what the workplace expected of them. So the teacher educators felt they lacked the authority, professional confidence, or institutional positioning to push back against those aspects of university context that they did not believe best served their students.
Rebecca,
most
can I
supervisors.
interject for just a moment? I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, please do.
One of the presenters is wondering if you would put it into present mode to make it a little bit larger, because what we see
Sure.
is the sidebar. Wonderful. Thank you. Sorry.
I keep it that way because I need to navigate, but I'll deal. Thanks. So most supervisors reported not feeling sufficiently included in an intellectual or structural fold of their programs. For example, they wanted to have more information about what students were learning in their courses. And then there were placement challenges where the supervisor was hoping for a constructivist classroom and wished that the candidates were in school serving low income, high priority communities. And yet often this was not the case in their participating schools. And then the last is not going to be news to you, but that the supervisors were working more hours than they were paid for was often a common finding there. And so this is a quote from this particular study. Supervisors suffer overwhelming workloads, feel marginalized by their institutions, lack ongoing training, and are often unclear as to what their role is. So I'm going to stop sharing for just a minute and see if folks have reactions to what I just shared.
In my experience, I've been doing this for at least 15 years. I think your findings are probably spot on. I know that none of us get paid what all the time we put into. I think I worked it out. We get 3 cents an hour for all the hours we put in. But, and I happen to feel that my institution definitely supports us, maybe not monetarily as we wish, but it supports us with ongoing professional development. And I have always felt in the loop, not necessarily in the university loop, but in the loop of all the supervisors. And until COVID, we had the opportunity on many occasions to get together with all our fellow supervisors. Actually, I'm not a supervisor anymore. I do the same thing, but now I'm called a fieldwork instructor. So anyway, those are my comments. Thank you for your research.
Okay,
Thank you.
I want to comment for UCI, and also wondering how many of us are also lecturers in their field. I am both a lecturer and a supervisor, and we do have the opportunity to meet together. COVID was a little different story, and learn from each other. So in a way, I feel privileged. I'm not feeling that I don't belong because of the 2 hats I wear.
Mm-hmm. So let's have a thumbs up if you're also a lecturer. So a few of us are in those positions of being lecturer supervisors. And I agree that those are 2 very distinct roles, and that the lecturers have more opportunities to interact with one another and to obviously know what's going on, at least in their own coursework, whether or not they know what's going on in other classes. Go ahead, Allison.
Well, thanks. Yeah, the first thing I was thinking was I feel seen throughout a lot of this, because I agree. I feel very privileged to be in my department where I do feel very supported. I have a full-time appointment because I am a lecturer and a supervisor. So even if I have a small supervision caseload, I will have classes to make up for that. And so, and being in that role was very purposeful in our program, which Cheryl could probably speak to since its inception. And at the same time, it was just really validating to hear that this is widespread about the institutional context of higher education, and feeling this way of just being generally unsupported and probably program wide. That's also probably true that the institutions, you know, I mean, it's the backdrop where we're doing our work, and it's in the moment, you know, when you're in the classroom, I feel like I can definitely push that aside, and I'm there with kids and families from the community, and with my supervisee, and all that can drop away. But in the background, when we're doing those hours of paperwork and trying to drive back and forth, and then we make it to our institutional meetings, and there's, you know, other treatment that we receive in the higher ed world, sometimes it can be really, you know, I'm sure everybody can relate, demoralizing. And I mean, and even in COVID, it's like certainly not at my institution, but I've heard administrators at other institutions say, like, well, maybe we just don't need to do teacher education this year. And it's like, you know, we can't take that out of our work, because it does impact us in terms of how can we show up as our best selves. So I just really wanted to say that I really appreciate your willingness to go there and really reveal this and talk about it.
Thank you. So I see that Barbara's mentioning that the candidates also have this sense of overwhelm, that we're being asked to do too much. And I'm noticing that most of the folks in the room are women. And I think that we're often positioned in this way. And unfortunately, we get used to it. And Allison's mentioning the emotional labor that this all entails. And I think that we need to empower one another, and hopefully that's going to be a message that comes through with some more of the data that I'm going to share with you. So one way that I think about the two-world pitfall challenge that was discussed earlier is, rather than thinking of it as K-12 versus the university, I think of it more as aspirational practice versus existing practice. So we have these ideals in our mind of what we would like classrooms to look like, that we would like to see a classroom that's student-centered, inquiry-oriented, equity-minded, constructivist, supported by authentic assessment and ongoing practitioner reflection. So that's the ideal that I think many of us share. And existing practice tends to be more teacher-centered, with scripted curricula, with standardized tests, and a more of a behaviorist response. And these two tug against each other, because we want our candidates to be able to teach in this existing world, but push it toward this aspirational world. And the university is impacted by both the aspirational aspects and the existing aspects, as is the K-12 school. And the reason I put the line down the middle in yellow here is that there are K-12 administrators and teachers who share our aspirations. It's not that they don't have them, but that this existing traditional world is pressing up against them more than it presses up against us at the university. But we have our own realities to deal with, like the TPA and limited hours and all these other things. So it's not that we at the university are only living in theory, and that at K-12 they're only living in practice, but that this tension between aspirational practices and existing practices exists in both places. Right now, our students are spending more time in the K-12 school than they are at the university. By my calculations, their coursework takes them 430 hours for the year, and they're required to be at the school site for 600 hours. So you as supervisors, or we as supervisors, are sitting right in the middle of all of this, trying to help the candidates negotiate existing versus aspirational practice, as well as the K-12 versus the university environment. So people who have looked at the work of supervision have looked at supervision conferences. The Zeichner-Listen study is one of the few studies that actually gathered data by researchers that examined what other people were doing. Most of the research in this realm tends to be self-study. And when they looked at supervision conferences in 1985, they found that most of the conversation was focused on what happened during the lesson. 63.2% of the conversation was coded as factual discourse or descriptive discourse. And then another 25% of it was advice, evaluation, and support about what happened. And then very little of it was focused on why were things happening as they were happening, and especially from a critical perspective, examining equity and justice aspects. So you can see that only 0.6% of the conversation was focused on equity and justice issues. More recently, a study by Griffin, Watson, and Leggett found that white female supervisors had a hard time with this critical discourse and shied away from discussions of race and class with their pre-service teachers. And they suggested that might be because the supervisors themselves had limited experience teaching children of races and cultures different from their own. But notice this is 12 supervisors at one institution. So we don't know how generalizable these results might have been. And Jacobs talks about the tensions that come from supervision for social justice. And our keynote speaker on yesterday alluded to these in her program, where supervisors recognize that pre-service teachers have limited time. The pre-service teachers might have a hesitancy to talk about race for fear of offending someone, especially their resident teacher. The pre-service teachers have limited knowledge of possible curriculum that are at variance with what the school district is offering. And then there's an ambiguity about who sets the agenda for supervision, whether it should be what the pre-service teacher wants to talk about, or whether the supervisor should be setting the agenda. And then Abden Perkins talked about how to be what they called this positive irritant is quite a challenging position for the supervisor to take. So I'm going to stop for a second and see whether these tensions resonate with you.
One of the things that I noticed just recently, not that I've always known this, but just in reflecting on my own practice and what I need to change and improve as a supervisor, is to use the professional learning communities that the fieldwork instructors are required to schedule for professional learning communities per semester, being a great opportunity to collaborate and share and educate and help our teacher candidates unpack their suitcases, right? But to focus on the TPEs that have language that's specific to equity, race, culture, and use those TPAs as opportunity to begin those authentic conversations with our candidates and our mentor teachers.
So let me see if I'm understanding your point that rather than using the post-observation conference, you use the, some of us might call it a seminar with your candidates where they're together with one another, that's the site that you use to raise equity issues with them. Is that right,
Yes,
Karen?
yes. Those are the opportunities that I have to do that. And of course, I also embed, you know, the requirements regarding a review of observations, you know, the criteria for observations and um, teaching practices, UDL and all of that. But it's a great opportunity during those PLC meetings to have those discussions about race, culture, inclusion, culture, and all of that.
Thank you. Other thoughts?
Well, I've spoken before. I don't want to dominate, but I always begin my conversation with my candidates with how they're feeling, how they thought the lesson went, or if it is not about a lesson, how are they feeling about what's going on in their classroom. But I always have a hidden agenda, and my agenda always, I'm always working for developing collaboration among students. And I'm also always working towards getting that teacher into that frame of mind, and also equity and just social justice issues. So no matter where we begin the conversation, I know that's where I want to lead. And there is, honestly, there's always been an opening for that. So in answer to your question, who leads the conversation? I always let them lead the conversation. They have so much on their plate, and they have the principal, they have the administration on their back. Then they go to classes and they have their instructors and their professors, and they have, I have to do this. And now we have our TTEs. So the more I can come from their stance, the more successful I feel our collaboration is going to be. And it always is. They always, I don't know, I look them in the eye and I say, listen to me and you're going to get through this. And I promise them, and I'll do anything for them. But that's how I start out. I have my hidden agenda and I move towards that. So, and that's based on my years of experience and the student-based classroom, inquiry, the whole ball of wax. Anyway, that's me. Just thought I would share.
No, I appreciate that.
I'll mute me now.
Pamela, you have your hand up.
Sure. Well, I'm really inspired by this conversation. And one of the things that our candidates do in our program is a debrief after their lesson. You probably all do that too. And I find that we make the questions up. And as I'm sitting here staring at our questions, we don't ask questions about social justice or equity in this forum. And just by I'm working with a team right now to revise forms and thinking, if we just plant a question in a place that everyone has access to that question. So it's not about one supervisor having the idea. I like it. I think I really want to take it to our team and impose, or plant a question.
Thank you. Darlene?
Yeah, I think to build on what Pamela just shared, I've been thinking about, what are the structural factors that need to be put in place so that we can continue to have conversations focused on racial justice, social justice, equity. I think in your review of the research, you mentioned, for example, the fear of offending the cooperating teacher. And I do think that's part of the whole process. And so what are the structural factors we have to put in, the structures that we should put in place in terms of I think it actually starts with how we work with young people in classrooms and whether they want to become teachers. And then how do we recruit those students into our programs, right? And what does our admissions look like? And then after admissions and their experiences in our program, then how do we keep that pipeline going so that they become our cooperating teachers, so that if racial justice is front and center, then those are the conversations that they're ready to have when they also host student teachers later, right? So I'm just thinking a lot about, okay, what are those pipeline structures that we need to put in place and that we really need to be committed to? And I think our roles in the institutions also can be, being in that liminal space of between the K-12 system and the university system has a lot of potential, and there's a lot of ways we can imagine the work that we can do. And I think it also means that sometimes there's a lot of uncertainty, so it's hard to create those pipelines, those sort of long-term visions for things, because we don't know from year to year what our situation is going to look like. So anyway, I'm just thinking about that, and just thinking about, the forums in my work, my candidates do have to identify ways that they're addressing social justice, and my work is in particular with ethnic studies teachers and ethnic studies goals, and so that does shift the conversation. We start there, and the cooperating teachers mostly are my alumni, so it's not so hard to do, but that has been 13 years of work in this program to even be at the point where I'm at, which is not in terms of having alumni as guiding teachers. And that's still not satisfactory, because I want it to be, 100%. And it's definitely more like 60% or something. But anyway, all that to say, I think there have to be those structures, especially because if we leave our programs or we move to different roles, then those connections also go away, right? And so how do we make sure that those pipelines are in place so that people continue to be connected with the work and continue to feel inspired to do it, collectively?
Thanks. Nicole responded that she appreciated your systems thinking about this. Robin?
I wanted to just agree with Darlene, but for those of us that don't even have a class, I don't know. I did have a class when we were doing Zoom on the pandemic, but now that we're going back face to face and all I do really is visit classrooms, I'm just thinking, all right, so how can I keep the pipeline going? And I think looking at TPE 2.2, it does have the words culturally responsive, reflect diversity and multiple perspectives. So I think it's going to be on my shoulders to simply say, at some point, I need to hit it with every student individually. All right, so, how are you dealing with race? Are you comfortable? But sort of force myself to have that conversation with the student, or do it the first day when I meet them as a class and just say, I want you to think about this. And we're gonna look from time to time about, do you talk to students equally, or do you give most of your attention to only certain students? Which is, that's what equity is all about, right? Does that seem like a beginning first step?
Sounds like it to me.
Okay.
Well, just to respond with my own efforts as a teacher educator in my math methods class, last year I met with each of the candidates before class started, and I asked them, well, how do you think you can be an anti-racist math teacher? And half of them raised their eyebrows and said, well, how can I do that? And I said, well, that's what I hope you'll keep thinking about the whole quarter. So it just sort of created the platform that question should be at the top of your mind all the time. How am I being an anti-racist educator? And if you can lay that groundwork with them from the get-go, then I think that gives you the opening to ask, how were you an anti-racist educator in this lesson that I just saw? And that gives you some insight, I think, also into how they're conceiving of themselves as an anti-racist educator, and whether we need to do more at the university to help them to broaden that conception potentially. Allison?
Thanks. I love what you just said too. And I've been thinking a lot about this recently and trying to push my own practices and my own methods class, which I get to teach my incoming supervisees, the English Language Arts Methods course. And so this year I've tried to make sure that every single day is embedded in anti-racist pedagogies and texts and readings. And, it'll be interesting to see if there's a difference in what happens in the classroom setting once they have that complex, system and where some of those fears that they regularly run into pop up. I think the climate these days for teachers is definitely more intimidating for some of them, but at the same time, it's all the more reason, right, why we need to make sure to support them and make sure that they keep doing this work. And I don't know if this will be helpful for anyone, but something that I've done when I've had student teachers who are either resistant or, just sort of like thinking really about the kind of traditional canon content and not really, getting outside their comfort zone. I tend to try something like just tallying who's speaking, who raises their hand on a seating chart. And I just say, what do you think is happening here? And then what do you think we can do to change that? And then hopefully, there have been times where it's very clear that there's a lot of white, mostly males, but mostly white English native speakers dominating, the discussions and who's getting redirected and ultimately moved seats or sent out. There's this very clear link to the research on the school to prison pipeline. And I think sometimes just seeing that is helpful for even the teachers who aren't afraid to commit to social justice. Sometimes they don't see how it's in every little micro decision and interaction that they have, and it could be unconscious. And I feel like that's sometimes a good door opening so that, we can name it as something that can be as simple as a participation structure can be anti-racist or not, or reinforcing, and so I don't know, I'm trying to figure this out. I'm grappling it with myself, but I'm trying to figure out how I can make it more explicit that everything we do, not just the texts we choose, for example, in an ELA class, can be anti-racist or not.
Thank you. I am putting in the chat the my slides because I'm not going to get through nearly all of them. And given what Allison was just talking about, I'm going to skip ahead and share something that some folks who were teaching a higher ed class, it was actually, I think, for principals, but they ended up coming up with these questions that helped the principals to locate equity issues in a teacher's practice. And these might be helpful to you in thinking about some questions to ask yourself that may end up in the feedback that you're providing to your candidates. The article that this comes from, you can click on this link and get to the article. And if you have any trouble getting to that article and you'd like to read it, you can email me. I'll put my email in the chat in a minute. And do you see racial, gender, or class patterns in student outcomes for a particular teacher? And does the teacher tend to discipline students from particular gender, racial, or income groups more than others? I think are part of what Allison was just talking about. I think for me anyway, the hardest part of this anti-racist work is figuring out how do we engage the K-12 children themselves in critically analyzing racism, sexism, classism in our society. And as a math educator, I find it particularly difficult to think about how we can engage them in this critical analysis in the math classroom, especially the K-8 math classroom. But I'm working, so that's where I'm working, is figuring out where we help kids to be anti-racist by the problems that we ask them to solve and the activities that we ask them to engage in the classroom. We only have a minute or two left because we're trying to give you a little time to breathe. The same article suggests that sometimes you may see something that leads you to be troubled, but to do nothing. Hopefully that's not consistently the case, and you decide when to interrupt and when to engage. And then you think about why you're responding that way. I want to leave with you all with this idea of organizing a group to engage in inquiry together. The work that we're talking about, I'm going to stop sharing for a sec. The work that we're talking about of being anti-racist supervisors, we've talked a lot about how this requires us to look at ourselves and then to examine our own practice. That's very hard to do alone. So I'm advocating that you find some critical friends to do this work with you. And even better for the larger community is that you share your efforts with the rest of us. This conference is a venue that we hope to be able to continue to offer you in years to come. And Lisa mentioned a grant that she and I applied for with the Spencer Foundation that would support teacher or action research groups of supervisors. That wouldn't happen until next year, but fingers crossed that we'll get the funding to support that. So those of you who are interested in joining a team of other supervisors to work together on this would have the opportunity to do that. MC Henderson has her hand up, so I'll give you a chance to share your thought. You're on mute right now.
Yes, okay. I just wanted to, and Dr. Black picked up on it too, the ethnic makeup of the student teachers and their own background. I would like to, with my student teachers, maybe raise that question: how will it influence your teaching, or how it has already influenced your responses in various classes? Because we're talking about the students, okay, but we're not talking about the race of the student teachers. Most of them, yes, will be white predominantly, but for me, I had a lot of Latinx and a lot of Asian. So it was an interesting and different point of view. That's just what I wanted to add.
Thank you. I was going to make a analysis of, we often hear that 80% of our candidates are white, although I think in California, that's not quite the case. Yeah. I know in our program, it's not. But then overlap it with our supervisors' races to see how frequently we have cross-race relationships between the supervisor and the student teacher, because I think that that affords some interesting conversations that are different than the conversations that a white supervisor might have with a white candidate, or a supervisor of color would have with a white candidate. So that's a dynamic that I think is ripe for some documentation or some research. So I see many people are expressing an interest in joining teacher research groups that want to talk about this further. So that's really good news to us. And we will be reaching out if we do get that money. But in the meantime, the more that you can collect evidence of your own work, whether it's just a videotape of an occasional interaction that you're having with your candidates that you examine yourself, or you invite a colleague to examine with you, I think that'll provide you with the reflective opportunity to think about how you can continue to grow as a professional. So thanks so much for joining us today.
Dr. Ambrose, thank you so much for this powerful, powerful presentation full of information. I feel so enriched with the information that you shared and moved by the content. It feels that the content just really hit home for a lot of my personal experiences. So thank you so much. Can folks join me in thanking Dr. Ambrose for her presentation today? We so appreciate it. And I want to thank all of you for coming today. We know that being a teacher supervisor is a calling for many of you, and we know that it comes from your heart and that you're passionate about serving your students as well as the students that they ultimately will serve. So thank you all for coming today. And I will definitely add the videotape from today, as well as any resources that Dr. Ambrose allows me to share in the folder, which the conference organizers are providing for us. Thank you all. Have a great